Throughout the history of Christian theology, perhaps one of the greatest mysteries that has successfully evaded the minds and understandings of theologians is the Incarnation. That is, how exactly do we reconcile the divinity of Christ on the one hand with the humanity of Christ on the other? Well, it is this question that we shall seek to address in greater detail over the course of this video. However, before jumping into the theology itself, it's important that we first get some context. In order to better understand the theology at play here, it will be useful to first outline some of the characteristics definitive of 5th century theology as a whole. The first of which was that it was political. Now, I need to add that while church politics was intensified in the 5th century, politics as a whole has relatively always been a problem in the church back since its inception, for the simple reason that people have the tendency to be political. That is, where there are groups of people, there are politics. So, a little newsflash for you all. Politics has always existed, and consequently will continue to exist as long as people exist. So let's just swallow the bitter pill and move on. Well, likewise, politics is also going to play a large role in the theological conflict of the 5th century. A second characteristic defining the theological conflict of the 5th century was that it was technical. Now, indeed, the theology of the previous century was also, no doubt, technical. However, the theology of the 5th century would reach a level unprecedented in previous centuries. And one of the problems that comes with high technicality is the potential for misunderstanding and conflict. Now, it must be stated that technicality is not necessarily always a bad thing, especially when we are dealing with central core teachings relating to the gospel and salvation. However, the technicality we see characteristic of the 5th century reaches a level of being almost too technical. And finally, a defining characteristic of this period was its fidelity to Nicene theology. Now, by Nicene, I mean upholding both, one, the triune nature of Father, Son, and Spirit as both one and distinct, and two, that Jesus is both fully divine and fully human. Well, by the 5th century, there really is no debate on these matters. Both sides of the conflict are going to unquestionably adhere to the creeds as set out by both Nicaea and Constantinople of the previous century. Particularly, there was really no question with regards to the full divinity and humanity of Christ. Rather, it is over how these two were reconciled to one another that the conflict centers. Well, as in the 4th century, the various representing views could be placed along a spectrum. On the one extreme, a group known as the Nestorians, named after the bishop Nestorius, believed Jesus was not only of two natures, but also two persons, working side by side with one another within the one visible Jesus. I guess you could call this a sort of internal partnership of ministry, with the human Jesus submitting to the divine. And according to this Christology, anytime we see the humanity of Jesus made manifest, it's the human side doing his role. And anytime there is a manifestation of divinity, it's the divine Jesus doing his thing. Now, you could probably work out which of the two was crucified. And as entertaining as this scenario might seem, you would be wondering why anyone in their right mind would believe something like this. Well, truth be told, nobody did. Because as historians would later find out, Nestorius never in fact believed such. Rather, this is the picture painted of him by contemporary opponents. Bear in mind the politics involved here. However, much of the false view is largely in part to misunderstanding of terminology. So in light of this, we're going to relabel this group Pseudo-Nestorianism, that is, Nestorians falsely so called. Rather, Nestorius believed that the humanity and divinity of Christ were paired together in a sort of conjunction. However, Nestorius believed this conjunction as a conjunction of wills. That is, the will of the divine nature in partnership with the human nature. Now, I want you to think about this for a second. What does that sound like when I say that Jesus had two wills inside of him? Well, generally, when we think of a will, we think of a person or agent behind that will. And so you could see how many would perceive this as a two-personed Jesus. So, what would drive Nestorius to such a radical conclusion? Well, the reason was simply that Nestorius feared a confusion or mixture in the two natures of Christ, and felt the only way to safeguard the distinction of natures was by means of a looser confederation of wills. Nevertheless, due to such misunderstandings, we see the rise of yet another group on the other extreme that would come to be known as the Monophysites, from the Greek words mono meaning one and physis meaning nature. That is, according to them, Jesus was one person consisting of only one nature. Well, this is where things get a little strange. Because if Jesus is only one nature, then the obvious question is, which nature? Or perhaps it might be better to ask, what nature? Now, we've already stated that all these groups are Nicene. That is, they believe that Jesus was both fully human and fully divine. So then, where is the one in this? Well, as was mentioned in a previous video, when we are dealing with divinity on the one hand, we are dealing with eternality. And on the other hand, when we are dealing with humanity, we are dealing with something that is temporal. Now, imagine I were to drain the entire Pacific Ocean and refill it with blue paint. Having done this, I then put in a drop of red paint and mix it in as thoroughly as is humanly possible. Okay, I know this is a completely implausible situation, but just go with it for now. What color would the ocean of paint now be? It would be blue, of course. But why not purple? Don't blue and red combine to make purple? Well, yes, but a drop of red isn't going to make one shred of difference in a massive sea of blue. Well, in a very similar fashion, the Monophysites explained that the humanity of Jesus was swallowed up in the eternality of his divinity. The humanity is still there in the mix, but it is completely dominated by his divinity. The question then being, can we even call him human? Well, that was the problem. So what was the drive behind such extreme Christologies? The answer is polemics. That is, much of their respective theologies was merely a reaction to the theology, and in some instances, extreme theology, of the other side. On the one side, we have the Nestorians who, in a fear of confusing the two natures together, emphasize their distinction to the point of separating them into two entirely different persons, held together merely by a common will. And on the other side, the Monophysites, in a fear of separating the natures, fuse them together to the point of destroying any distinction whatsoever between them. However, part and parcel to polemics was the continued influences of more extreme heresies of earlier centuries. And if we take a closer look at Nestorianism, we see strains of Ebionism at work. Now, while indeed Nestorius' teaching is a far cry from Ebionism proper, it nevertheless exercises an influence in how it places a slight emphasis on Christ's humanity at the expense of his divinity. Likewise, on the other extreme, we see slight influences of Docetism within the Christology of the Monophysites as well, placing a slight emphasis on Christ's divinity at the expense of his humanity. Now, the problem with both of these Christologies is that they simply ignore either one of two vital components of the Incarnation. That is, that Jesus is both one person and two natures. But why is it important that Jesus be both simultaneously one person and two natures? Well, for the simple reason that life and therefore salvation are in God alone. And therefore, in order for life to be regenerated back into degenerate humanity, God, that is, divinity, had to enter into degenerate humanity in order to fully revive him. As Romans 8 verses 3 through 4 states, "For what the law was powerless to do, and that it was weakened by the flesh, God did by sending his Son in the likeness of sinful man, and with regards to sin, condemned sin in the flesh." And so, in order for Jesus to fully heal humanity corrupted by sin, he had to be both the physician and the patient. That is, only in a single person of united natures can Jesus be both he who heals, God, as well as he who is healed, humanity. However, if Jesus were, on the one hand, only one nature, then he would be neither human nor divine, but something else entirely, and therefore he could thus neither heal nor be healed. On the other hand, if Jesus were two separate persons, then it wouldn't truly be God becoming human and thus ineffective in bringing destruction to the sin living within humanity. Therefore, in order for Jesus to bring salvation and complete restoration to fallen humanity, he had to be one person consisting of two natures, united but not confused. This particular Christology, what would become known as Chalcedonian theology, deriving its name from the Fourth Ecumenical Council of 451, is in fact the balance between the two extremes of Nestorianism on the one hand and Monophysitism on the other. Well, the conflicts of the 5th century would be resolved in the Third and Fourth Ecumenical Councils of Ephesus and Chalcedon, respectively. Ephesus in 431, which condemned Nestorianism, and Chalcedon in 451, which condemned Monophysitism. However, there were also two more groups sandwiched between these that were neither heretical nor Chalcedonian. That is, the Miaphysites and the Nestorians proper. Now, as far as this video is concerned, we don't really have time to go into some of the more technical details concerning these two groups. But in essence, both held to beliefs that were more or less orthodox in their understanding of Christ. The difference being that they lean slightly more in one direction or the other, either towards his humanity or his divinity. However, due to politics and miscommunication over technical terminology, the Church would experience what would later become known as one of the first great schisms in the history of Christendom. Well, it is these three groups in the center which would become known as the three great branches of Orthodox Christianity that have remained to this day. The group on the left becoming what we refer to as the Church of the East, the group on the right, the Oriental Church, including but not limited to what we know of today as the Coptic and Armenian churches, and the group in dead center as the Chalcedonian Church, or simply the Western Church. Well, it is from this group that we derive what would later become known as Eastern Orthodoxy, Roman Catholicism, and Protestantism, a group undoubtedly making up the lion's share of Christendom. Now, while Chalcedon was only one in a long series of ecumenical councils, it nevertheless served as a summarizing creed, pulling together all previous councils into one grand declaration of essential Christian beliefs. More specifically, included in the creed is the following. That is, that God is one being in three distinct persons, and that Christ Jesus, the second person of the Godhead, is one person of two natures, both fully human and fully divine. Now, while many within the Church, particularly in the Greek East, would continue in this debate over the coming centuries, it's really at Chalcedon that we finally reach something of a resolution and completion in the development of Christology. And therefore, it is for this very reason that we shall end our discussion here. But above all, it is my hope that this series has served the informative purpose, not only of the most essential elements of Orthodox Christology, but also of the most essential and foundational elements of Orthodox Christianity. Thanks for watching. I invite all questions and comments in the discussion section, so please feel free to write or ask any questions below. Thanks.